All right, it is time. This is the NetCon Working Group IETF115 meeting. You will notice that we have added a personnel to the working group. We'd like to welcome Per Anderson as Secretary to the NetCon Working Group. So you should be familiar with the note well, in particular BCP 79, which covers the patents and participation aspect of IETF, but also want to make a special note of BCP 54, which is the Code of Conduct. Basically, the idea is all participants are expected to be participating with grace in the meetings. If you have not, just be familiar with all aspects of your contributions to IETF in these meetings, as well as on the mailing list. If you're in the room, there is a special client of MeetEcho for you to participate. If you're remote, then you get a full access to all the icons. Basically, in the room, you can raise your hand and join the queue, but none of the audio and video settings are available to you, while the remote get the full version of it. Watch the chat window for comments, and this can be made as a separate window. Going forward, IETF has decided to go with Zulip as a tool to do your chats on. There's a URL provided there. We have a 2-hour slot, and it's a fairly full agenda, so we expect to keep to the time as much as possible. We'll try to also set a countdown timer at the bottom of the screen. Anyway, we hope we don't have to cut off any of the speakers. The queue, of course, to speaking, whether it's in the room or remotely, will be managed through MeetEcho. Make sure you queue yourself up with using the icon with the hand symbol. And when you do speak remotely, make sure you use the icon with the play window. And finally, of course, do make sure that you remove yourself from the queue once you're done talking. We do have a notepad. Please contribute to the minute taking, especially to presenters and people who are asking questions, so that we make sure we have gotten all the notes correctly. And this also can be made as a separate window or tab if you choose to do it that way. So where are we with the status of documents in the working group? The HTTPS notif draft has entered IETF last call. Thanks, Robert. The client server suite of drafts, the authors have gone through and resolved all the received Shepard's review comments. There is just one Shepherd review that is on my plate that I need to complete for the complete suite of drafts. The UDP notif and the distributed notif drafts are work in progress, and they will be discussed in this meeting. The adaptive subscription draft was adopted as experimental and is also work in progress in the working group. We did adopt 3 new drafts since the last time. The TLS 1.3 list pagination and transaction ID. And those are also going to be discussed in this meeting. As I said, we have a fairly full agenda. We have Under the chartered items, we have the UDP-based transport and subscription to distributed notif that Alex will be presenting. Then we have the list pagination draft, which actually, not Ken, but I believe you're presenting, right? Okay. And then NetConf TLS from Sean, and Jan will present the transaction ID. Finally, Shufang will present the adaptive subscription draft. In the non-chartered items, we have 4 drafts that will be presented today. All right. Any questions before we get started? Right. Let me stop. Kent, do you want to take over at this point?
Yes. As a point of order for any remote participants, if you wish, I will pass control for the slides to you. If in room, please just say next slide.
We have an issue with audio. Let's see.
Hello to everyone, this is Alex on behalf of the UDP Notif drafts, and I am presenting today an update. Next slide, please. So on the agenda today, I am presenting the different changes we made on the last submitted draft. I wanted to discuss and trigger the discussion through the working group because I did not receive a lot of feedback through the mailing list. I also wanted to present the last plan changes for the next iteration, and last one, the gap we found on Young Push. So next slide, please. So on this last submitted draft, we updated the requirements language. On the last IETF, I also met Sean Turner, and thanks again for the feedback. We merged the first 3 subsections of this DTLS section, and we added some more phrases, such as zero RTT data that must not be used in UDP Notif, since it's not encrypted. And also that in unsecure networks, this DTLS layer must be used instead of should. Then, of course, on the Young module, the DTLS container has been made presence container. The flag to enable this DTLS layer has been removed. And then the DTLS 1.2 parameters has been removed from the grouping. As Rob proposed, we added a third YANA registry to manage the UDP Notif shim header version. And feedback from Benoit, the security considerations has been moved to the end of the draft, and a limited domains reference has been added to this same section. So next slide, please. So there are some discussions going on in the mailing list. The first one concerns the Young module. There is Tom Page who thinks that the current Young module prefix is not right. The current prefix is UN for UDP Notif, but he thinks that it should have a common pattern for the whole family. So subscribe notifications, Young push, NetConf notifications, and so on. As authors, we don't have any problem to change this prefix. So maybe SN and something specifying that it's UDP native, since the YAM module is augmenting subscribe notifications. But then also the question would be, okay, if we do that, what about the rest, right? There is HTTPS native with HNT, YAM push with YP, and so on. So yeah, I would like some feedback from the working group on what to do with that. Should we change UN to SN-UN or stay like that, or?
Rob, you might have to. There's no,
Yeah.
go ahead. And
So Rob Wilton, just as a participant, I'm not sure this matters too much to me in terms of it's only a local prefix anyway. So I quite like these being short. So I'm not so convinced. I think the UN's probably fine. If you were to change it, I would certainly suggest you put like a hyphen in the middle. So if you do Yang YP-UN or something, I don't know what you're suggesting would be my recommendation, but I don't think they should block this draft really. You could solve this.
Okay, then maybe staying with UN or anyone? Then also to configure the receiver IP, so to which IP we are sending these YAM push notifications messages. We are using the IP address, which by default is with zone, allowing to specify, for example, an IPv6 address link scope. The question on the mailing list was why using this one? As authors, we don't mind changing it to IP address with no zone. So the same here. What do you think? Should we change it to IP address no zone, or should we stay just with the current one? Yeah.
So Rob Wilton again. This one, again, as a contributor, this one's trickier because I'm not sure there's clear indication exactly which way we should go with the IP addresses. I think using IP address no zone is a fairly safe thing to do at the moment, so that doesn't cause any harm. Yeah, that seems like a pragmatic solution. It may be longer term we try and fix this in a better way, a different way, but I think just doing that for now would be fine and just sort of removes the problem. So it's sort of good enough, is my opinion.
Thanks, Rob. And then on the last one, each regarding the YAM module. So yeah, next slide, please. So here, for me, in my opinion, HTTPS notif and UDP notif, they are the transport for NetConf notifications. Well, I know that UDP notif is for subscribe notifications, which is a little more specific, but they are both transport. And what I think is that they should be configured the same way. And right now, the current YAM module from UDP notif is based on an example of subscribe notification RFC. But HTTPS native took actually another approach to configure that. So they have receivers YAM module, which defines, depending on the transport, the parameters. And then on the receiver leaf, they are referencing the actual receiver instance. So here would be the same. Should UDP notif be configured the same way as HTTPS notif, or should we stay just at it? Because, yeah, as I said, both are the transport for NetConf notifications. I do like the idea of having to configure them the same way. So, yeah. Yeah,
Hi,
Ken.
this is Kent as a
Mm.
contributor. So the need for why the HPS Notif did it that way was because it was a TCP-based transport, and hence the desire for the server to have a single transport connection to the receiver, regardless the number of subscriptions that were pointing to it or using it. For UDP being sessionless, the technical requirement isn't there. But for consistency's sake, it makes sense to me that it would actually use that same pattern.
Yeah, I do agree. Okay, so then next slide, please. And yeah, so on the last IETF also I had Joe Clark who approached me and saying that maybe the DTLS layer might impact performance, and that it might be interesting to add a section saying that implementing DTLS layer might impact the performance. As authors, we do think that this is actually pretty obvious. But yeah, I do want some feedback if it is actually necessary for the draft.
As a contributor again, I have not seen this kind of language used in other drafts where encryption was being used for quite some time. So I don't really see a need for it in this draft.
Okay, we don't do that. Thanks. Yeah, next slide, please. And then lastly, on the next iteration, we are working on what to do with the messages that are that have unordered options. So we added the phrase that they may be dropped. We plan to add both examples, one for the configuration of UDP Notif and one for the message notification. And then since we had some feedback from the developers that this message ID and your observation domain ID was not clear or not in the draft, we proposed some text. This text is already sent to the mailing list, so it would be nice if I could get some feedback. And since the DTLS, I do think that it is already stable. We do think that the current draft is ready for the SecDir review. Next slide, please. Yeah, that's all for UDP Notif. And then I just wanted to point out the gap we found in Young Push specification. So the NetConf event notifications header is defined in 5277 using XML schema. It's the orange one, and the Young Push, the yellow one, is defined with a Young module. So when the message is actually encoded in XML, there is no problem because you can get the NetConf event notification from the XML schema and the Young Push header from the Young module. But the problem arises when this message is encoded in JSON, maybe in the future iteration in CBOR, that we don't have the NetConf event notifications in a Young module, which does not allow us to actually parse it using Young JSON or Young CBOR. So yeah, I just wanted to point it out that that we want to implement to write a new draft by the next IETF, filling that gap. Yeah, Joe Clark.
Since I was called out, I had to refresh my memory of why I wanted DTLS called out. And the use case you referred to last time was distributing it to the line cards. And that was what I was wondering, if the line cards off of the control plane are now tasked with sending out, encrypting and sending this out, would there be a performance impact to what the line cards are otherwise doing from a data plane perspective? That's what I was getting at. I realize encryption is fairly common, but this seemed like a special case. By the way, Joe Clark, Cisco. I'm sorry, I should have done that earlier. But that's what I was getting at.
Thomas from Swisscom. So here just one question regarding the new draft on the NetConf event notification. My question, should it update the RFC 5277 or should that be a separate draft? That would be interesting for me to know. Thanks.
Benoit Claes. So Joe, I checked in IPFix, right? And the section about DTLS, if you were speaking about performance, but we don't there. So I took this as a reference that we don't need to speak about performance, just as a comparison.
Regarding the question from Thomas, I don't mind updating the NetConf event notifications, but I don't know the actual IETF process. So I'd like if anyone have any proposals on that, we are open to that.
All right, can we bring it to the mailing list?
Yeah,
The
of course,
question.
no problem. Then next slide, please. Yeah, and a little update on the distributed notif. Next slide. So no, there is no updates on this distributed notif draft. And as I said in the last IETF, this draft has only one reference in UDP notif, so it is waiting for UDP notif to be last called to be last called in this one. So next, yeah.
Balazs is in the queue. Balazs, do you have a comment?
Balazs, you can use that mic now.
Sorry, there was earlier a draft about NetConf notifications, NetConf messages and bundles. I think it was proposed. You should have a look at it if that serves your purpose for the previous question.
Can you send me the reference or something, please? If you have it, otherwise I'll share it for you. Thanks. Yeah, and that will be all. Thank you for your attention.
Right. Thanks, Alex. Next, we have Per.
Okay, hi, my name is Per, and I'm going to present the status and a few discussion points about list pagination for set of drafts for NetConf and RESTconf. Yeah, you can take next slide. So the motivation and goal is to standardize mechanisms for paginating, sorting, and data over NetConf and RESTconf, and to better utilize the underlying database index capabilities. You can go to the next slide. So the three drafts are a main draft, for Django-driven protocols, and then 2 protocol drafts, one for NetConf and one for RESTconf, for the specifics of the protocol. You can take the next slide. So there has been no published change since the last IETF meeting, but there has been a few questions raised in the in this small group that is working on it. And I also heard that there's another question that is not in these slides. So the questions that have been raised is if we should support cursor-based pagination instead of just a limit and offset without snapshots, and if we should also work on supporting paginating a snapshot of the data store. And the other question I think I heard was the locale-based sorting with different languages and locales, and how that should be solved, or if we have thought about that, or if we're going to work on that. Next slide, please. So the idea for the cursor-based pagination now is to have one new query parameter called cursor, which would be base 64 encoded position. And for the start position, there's the question then of how it should be encoded. Should it just be empty? Should it be some sentinel value and so on? And then you could use the limit to size the pages then that you paginate. Next slide. So having a base 64 encoded opaque value would give some. It would be a generally unique, well, obviously unique value, of course, but for instance, the instantiated key or something in the list. It could bring some more encoding that you could put in there for the underlying database layer. Then. Next. Yeah, and so this could be one example then with the RESTconf request. So the cursor is then the base 64 encoded string Alice, and then we limit it to 2 posts. And then you get this annotations for the attributes of the list pagination then. And we have the next cursor, and the previous cursor is the start. So it's in this case, it's an empty leaf, and the next cursor is then Joe base 64 encoded. Next. So this is the discussion about if we want to support snapshots of paginating snapshots of the data store. Then they can be very costly. So how would that work, and what constraints and limitations do that push down to the server? Yeah, that's it. I think that's the last slide. Yeah.
Jason's in the queue.
Hi, Jason Stern. Sorry, I haven't followed the draft as closely as I should, but is there discussion about snapshots for config versus state? Because state for very large lists where this is probably applicable strikes me as probably not very feasible or practical, but maybe config might be. So I don't know if maybe it'd be 2 separate discussions.
Yeah, so that is not really decided yet, but that question has been raised, that they can be very large, and how would such a snapshot work of operational data, for instance?
Hi, Kent, as a contributor and also an author, but to Jason's comment, interestingly, I think the reason or need for or desire for snapshots is primarily for the operational state list, and your point's very well taken, but for configuration, it's been how long now? Over a decade that we've been able, or clients have been able to completely load all the configuration. The need for paging over configuration data is not extensive. The need for pagination is primarily, I think, for the operational data. And I think when this was discussed previously, the concerns were that the operational data would be changing very quickly underfoot, and that was the reason for wanting to track it. Of course, configuration data could also be changing, but then the counterpoint was made that something like RESTCONF's ETAG or Jan's draft for propagating the equivalent concept to NetConf could be used to detect when those kinds of changes have occurred.
Rob Wilton, no hats. So just a question on the snapshot. Are you snapshotting the entire data of the things being retrieved, or is there a choice just to snapshot the keys? So you make sure you get a consistent view of the keys in the data, but you allow the data to need to potentially be changing and updating. Has that been thought about?
So I've not been into those discussions. Maybe Kent, you have some opinion?
Yeah, Kent as a contributor again. I think that's an implementation detail. Right? From the client's perspective, they just would snapshot, and then but to your point, implementation, it would make sense to maybe just track the keys. It'd be easier to do that.
So I guess my question is all about the consistency of the data that's being returned. What are you guaranteeing? Are you guaranteeing that you're going to return at that snapshot point, you're going to return all the stuff, all that data in a consistent way? Or are you just going to guarantee you're going to return the latest values for each entry in that list?
I'm sorry, I misunderstood. The intention is that it's a snapshot frozen in time. So all the data that existed at the time the snapshot was taken should be returned.
Okay.
I think that's the generally understood implementation in other databases as well.
Jason Stern here, I guess just commenting on that. So I kind of like the idea Rob was proposing at first, but then does introduce a bit of a hybrid if we're either standardizing and saying it has to be a snapshot or it's implementation specific. If it's fully implementation specific, then probably some implementations could do keys. But if we standardize a snapshot, it might be a bit of an odd hybrid to have just the keys snapshotted and not the rest of the data. Just back to the original point about config versus state, I can see your point, Kent, about it being more needed for state. I guess I'm still struggling with if it's a case that's really needed, it's probably a very big and changing data set. So it's either going to be very expensive to snapshot, or it's going to be churning for you as you page. So I don't have a solution. I'm just saying the use case seems very difficult to solve.
Kent, as a contributor again, replying to Jason, I think the strongest use case is for logs, where they're always being appended to the end of the log. And for the most part, they're read-only. Hence, earlier logs are not being deleted as you're moving through them. So I imagine there probably are cases where items are being deleted sometimes, but and maybe there's other operational state lists that are enormous and they're not like logs where the data is being appended to the end. But I think that by far and away the largest use case is for logs.
Yeah, Jason here again. I can see your point for logs where that's kind of just entries being appended to an end of a flat buffer. But it'd be interesting to see if other people are thinking of, well, I'm going to dump my rib this way and give me a snapshot, etc. Something that's dynamic, huge and dynamic that operators might want to look at for whatever reason.
I'm Rob Wilton. And in the case of logs, if it's an append-only log, do you need a snapshot at all? Wouldn't that automatically have the same consistency if you just had a cursor over it in terms of reading the next values? What's the snapshot buying you?
Okay, so just quickly to reply to Rob, your good point, but I see Andy and Jeff in the queue. So Andy first.
We have a operation called Get Bulk, which has been deployed for about 6 years or so. It is used mostly for counters, an operational state. I've never heard of it being used for logs, but it returns the last keys, and then the next request return. The client cans those keys back, and that's where we keep from. Otherwise, you can't use a cursor because there's constantly entries being added and deleted. So the cursor is meaningless over time. So unless you're using a snapshot, in which case you've taken the data off to the side and you're letting the client iterate through it. But if you're just using a stateless solution where there is no snapshot, a cursor doesn't work.
Jeff, next in the queue.
Jeff Haas, Juniper. So the thing that makes this messy, having just briefly glanced through the draft, is sorts and limits, and depending on the stream, where the stream of the data is. So for things like files, if you're applying a sort or a limit on that, you theoretically can regenerate all the necessary state as long as the files are not constantly changing. The case of large data, like a BGP rib as an example, that's a case where in a lot of circumstances, as long as you're not trying to apply sorting or limiting, there's a good chance that keeping track of the last displayed key is sufficient to allow you to resume your iteration through the module, as long as the container order is something that makes sense that can be continued. And for things that are very large, like BGP ribs, that's generally how things tend to be implemented. So I guess one of the questions is, should the use cases be split up so that you can decide, can things be iterated based on keys versus cases where the only way to generate where that is basically taking the snapshots. So does a snapshot need to happen, or can you generate the necessary thing just simply by using an iterator?
Again, as a contributor, just quickly, the solution currently in the draft is to allow the server to specify for which operational state lists it supports various functions. And so the draft might implement an ability to do snapshots, but the server can specify if it supports it on a list-by-list basis. So for those append logs type lists where snapshots really don't make that much sense, perhaps it's not there, but for a rib, the server might say that it does support the snapshot for it. So I think we might be able to provide the solution on a more granular basis. And with that, actually, I think we're running close to being out of time. So moving to the next slide.
Yeah, that was the thing we did.
All right. Thanks, Cliff.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So I'm John Lindblad. Next slide, please.
Hey, I just passed the presentation control to Jan, and now I'm going to take it. Okay, do it again. There we go.
Thank you. Yeah, so it's the draft has been adopted now finally, and I'm very happy for that. Thank you for all for supporting it. But in the adoption process, we were blocked by an IPR disclosure issue. So things stopped for a while, but this claim has now been cleared, so that was enabling the adoption. But that also means that nothing really happened to the transaction ID draft since 114. So what should I spend the 10 minutes on? So one of the things I've been getting a lot of questions about is how this one overlaps with several other drafts that are in motion right now. So I thought I'll spend a few minutes on trying to clarify that. Next, please. So in order to not fill the slides with these extremely long names, I shortened them a bit. You see on the left-hand side my abbreviation for these drafts. So the trans ID is the one that I'm talking about today. We have configuration trace. We have W3C trace. We have the private candidates, and we have the RFC 8040, the REST-conf e-tags solution also. Next slide, please. So I put them all into a single table and see how what they try to solve. And it looks like I'm trying to promote Trans ID because it has all the check marks as you have seen in the marketing documents. But this is actually not the case because I just selected these particular things because that's what this draft is talking about. And these other drafts are talking about a lot of other issues that this one is not talking about at all. And I just included these ones. So one of the issues that the transaction ID draft is trying to work with is to reduce the locking time, so that clients wouldn't have to lock for long periods of time. And that is something that this private candidate draft is also trying to address. E-tags, of course, does not, because in REST-conf there are no locks. Another thing that transaction ID is trying to solve is to look at allowing clients to synchronize what has changed only. Get me the diff, please. The config trace draft is also talking about that use case, but it's not really specifying anything on its own. And I think, I hope it means that it depends on, assumes that transaction ID or something like it already exists. They're nodding here at the front row, so that was good then. So it's this is necessary functionality for configuration trace, I believe, and relevant, but it's not defined in there itself. E-tags, of course, is doing this for REST-conf. At least to some degree, I would say. E-tags for REST-conf is a limited version of this, I would say. And the reverse use case where you have a configuration in the server already, and you have a client that's trying to update something and is interested to detect if somebody else has been writing the same area as this client. It's an important use case when you have multiple clients to the same server. And again, the config trace is also discussing this use case, and it seems to me that it's depending on a transaction ID or something like that. And we have similar discussions in the private candidate draft. It's no text in there right now, I believe, that's talking about this use case, but it's being discussed, so it's a maybe. And in this case, I think the e-tag solution is quite similar or quite functionally equivalent to a transaction ID one. Something that I think is important also is this Yang push case when you're pushing configuration updates to a Yang server and you have a Yang push subscription. You will hear an echo of what you just committed to it. And it's very useful for the client to know, oh, this is actually what I just sent down, so I don't need to think so much about it, or the other way around. I want to care especially much about it so I can verify that everything turned out exactly as I needed to be. And the other draft here are not talking about that use case so far. And we have this idea about for clients to say, hey, this is my orders, this and that number, and it's being mapped to these actions on these devices, and I want to see what the impact was in the network, maybe for billing or for forensics, or there are many, many reasons why you would want to do that. And the first version of the transaction ID draft had functionality for that, but it was from feedback from this forum in earlier meetings, it was said remove that, so I did that. It's not included now. But now instead there are two separate drafts that are addressing this particular problem. We have the config trace one and the W3 trace one that is looking at exactly this. How do you trace configuration or other, actually it's not just configuration changes in these cases, it's generally actions towards the device, what impact do they have on the devices. So those config trace and the W3 trace are bigger solutions than what transaction ID had. But it's a question here. So do we want to go further and continue this discussion with these two drafts and leave it out of transaction ID maybe? Things are possible here, I don't know. If there are any immediate comments about how you think that particular tracing should happen, you're welcome to say. I don't see any particular quick reactions here, but we can take it up later on the mailing list. Oh, Kent, please.
As a contributor, well, I mean, if the transaction ID draft can check all the boxes, it seems convenient for one solution to solve them all, so to speak. But what I don't understand yet is, are these other solutions doing checking the boxes in a better way? And so I don't understand that part just yet.
Thanks, Kent. I guess Balázs?
I think the transaction ID, Balázs Lengyel Eriksson, transaction ID solves rows 2 and 3, which are very immediate needs in a nice and easy way. These are not yet addressed in the others, so I see the need for this draft. It could be somehow harmonized with the trace drafts. And one more thing, that if we put back this removed capability, that has a potential for conflicts. What if the proposed transaction ID is not suitable for some reasons? So yeah, that has problems. Thanks.
Hi, Olga Havel, Huawei. I did a similar table when looking at all these three, and initially when I read, I said, oh, there is an overlap. But then when I thought about individual use cases for each one of them, it was obvious that for transaction ID, it's a sync, conditional configuration, etc. You know, configuration that there is then on the other one is hierarchical, Jean's and Benoit's hierarchical tracing between multiple layers, and then on the third one, it's application tracing, which is a separate use case again. So I don't believe you can do syncing and conditional configuration without transaction ID. But then again, maybe it's not either or. Maybe there is a need for all three to coexist.
Absolutely.
Hello, Jean Kilbeuf. It's the same comment as Olga. Basically, I think the transaction ID can continue on its own, and maybe we need to have some management for the other draft as well. But I think it makes sense to have just the transaction ID on one side, and then the configuration tracing is with whatever method on the other side.
Thank you. Yeah, my personal opinion is that I think it makes sense to have this tracing in a separate draft and not have it in transaction ID. They are in the scope for the configuration trace and W33 trace is larger and maybe better benefit. Even though I think for implementers that would implement transaction ID would probably want to implement the tracing at the same time. I think it's closely related. So implementers would have to deal with 2 or maybe 3 drafts in that case. So, Balázs, do you have another? You have your hands raised there. Okay. The remaining time, I will just do a recap of what these use cases are like, so we can take the next slide. So allow clients to get config changes, and then, of course, without locking. You have this traditional on the left here. Client is doing a get config to the server and getting a block of data back. And if he wants to see, is there any changes, he would do a get config again and get the same block of data, or maybe some changes deep down somewhere. And that's, of course, a massive effort to do that continuously. Whereas with transaction ID, you would do a get config and ask for transaction ID, and you get a block of data associated with transaction IDs. And then you do a get config again, and you tell the server, this is what I already know, and those parts that are the same are not sent back. Next slide, please. And here's a case where you try to avoid configuration clashes. So a client might want to synchronize with the server, do a get config and get a block of data, and then intends to do an edit config, which is changing something in that. But in the meantime, somebody came in from right here, edit config, and suddenly 2 clients are clobbering each other, and they might not even detect it. Whereas on the right side, you do the get config, you get the transaction ID back, and then you do an edit config with the condition that the transaction ID is this and that. And if it has changed, you will get an error return back from the server. Next slide, please. And here's for the Yang push subscription case where a client is subscribing. And if somebody does an edit config, you get a update a transaction ID, and they see that, oh, the thing that came back now was not mine config change, actually. It was something else that happened. And in the right case here, you send an edit config with a transaction ID, and then you get an update back with the same expected transaction ID. You know, oh, this is actually what I already knew. Next. Yeah, and these are some numbers that I did. It's probably a year ago now. When I applied this in the lab environment, we had a real-world management application running in our lab for a particular use case for 1 hour, and it made 569 requests in the original case. But with this sort of transaction ID there, with going back and forth, we reduced the number of round trips with 34%, and the payload size went down from a megabyte to 547 kilobytes. So I think we saved some cycles there. But maybe more importantly than saving network bandwidth is that we don't have to do locking, and we can get some performance increases from that. And we don't get this undetected clashes. That was all I had on this one.
All right, I guess we don't have anyone in the queue, so thanks, Jan.
Thank you.
Sorry, we skipped over the TLS 1.3 draft, but maybe we can go back to that.
Sorry.
Hi, I'm Sean Turner. Nice to see all your masked up faces again. Hey, I'll keep this simple. I only got one slide. Next. So we had a 0.0 version that came out that was pretty much identical to the individual draft. And so 0.1 is basically addressing anything that we received during working group adoption. There were a couple of editorials that I got off list, so I kind of made those. You can follow the links if you're really interested. One of the comments we also got was from Jürgen. He's like, hey, you know, the draft in which you're basing this on is RFC 7589, and it already gets rid of or obsoletes RFC 5539. So why are you doing it again here? And he's right. So we just dropped all references to it. And then one of the other things that happened was Drev Dodi basically came and said, hey, this draft really applies to PC as well. Can we just take the draft and apply it over there? And we were like, sure. So they basically got a couple of comments that clarified the text a little bit to make sure that, you know, it's really clear that you can do TLS 1.3 without 0 RTT. So it's perfectly okay to do that. And then we wanted to clarify also that the requirements apply to implementations that support 1.3, and it's not that we're musting or making TLS 1.3 the mandatory to implement, because that wasn't kind of the goal of the draft. So now we have these two drafts. They're basically kind of aligned. At this point, we have no known issues. I know it is just a 0.1 version, and it's like brand spanking new. But at this point, I don't have anything else to do. So can we get a working group last call? I don't know what the process is that you guys want to do with this, but at this point, I don't know of any known issues. And so basically, smart people that do NetConf, take a read. Let me know if you think it makes sense. And if you don't have anything else, let's get done.
Sounds good. I think we can take a poll.
Ooh, look at that. Great. Instant gratification is a thing. Ta-da, look at that.
Okay, we seem to have an overwhelming response as a yes.
All right, and I'll yield the rest of my time.
We'll start the process after the
Great.
meeting.
Thank you very much.
So hello everyone, this is Chu Song from Huawei. And this presentation is about adaptive subscription to YARN notification. So next slide, please. Yeah, for people who are not familiar with this work, as we all know that YARN push has provided a way to allow the server to continuously push updates to the receiver. And for periodic subscription, the updates are streamed periodically based on a config time interval. But sometimes we might find it hard to configure the period interval because usually a very high frequency data collection could be very easy to identify the operational data generation, but also at the cost of a great volume of data. While a low frequency data collection can greatly reduce the data volume, but also could be hard to detect the important events and data generation. So our goal is want to seek the balance between the expensive data management cost and the real-time stream telemetry data for the troubleshooting. And our main idea is to perform the adaptive subscription policy built on top of the YARN push mechanism and allow the servers to switch to different update intervals automatically based on the network condition changes. So next slide, please. Yeah, so since last IETF meeting, I think Adrian has had a very thorough and detailed review of this document. So the authors would like to thank Adrian for the helpful comments, and most of the comments are the editorial changes to improve the readability. And besides that, we also update the adaptive subscription YARN module, for example, to add the contact editor information, fix the IETF trust copyright statement, and fix the validation errors, etc. And besides that, we also clarify that the period parameter must coexist with the XPath external evaluation expression parameter. Yet, the client is allowed to configure multiple period with corresponding XPath 1.0 expressions, and they both defined as the mandatory true in the YARN module. But the latest version of the draft just states clearly that the period parameter must coexist with this expression condition expression, and only if the XPath condition is evaluated as true, the publisher will switch to the corresponding configured period. So this period is used to push updates. Yeah. So next slide, please. And another update is that we also clarify that existing RPC failures defined in the RFC 18639 and 18641 are still applicable to this document. For example, if any config period is not supported by the publisher, so it can still send a period unsupported RPC error response. So that's also okay. And the last one is that we have defined a RPC error in our draft, which is named multiple XPath criterion conflict. And this RPC failure can be used when you have multiple XPath evaluation expression and they are evaluated as conflict. That also means that more than one condition is evaluated as true at the same time. So the previous draft said that such RPC error could also cause an ongoing adaptive subscription terminated. But instead of saying that, the latest version of the draft just said that if it's during the life cycle of an adaptive subscription, and the server can still push updates at the shortest streaming period. So next slide, please. Okay, so any comments?
Okay, we don't seem to have any. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thomas from Swisscom. So this is a new document which we're presenting here at NetConf, introducing support for versioning and semantics in Yang notifications. Next slide, please. So in a data mesh, big data architecture where different domains can exchange data about the context, bounded context relies that we always have semantics and versioning. And semantics means basically that we know the difference between when we see a value, if it's a GOG or a counter, or for instance, an IP address or a string. So for a counter, for instance, we need to do monotonic increasing counter normalization, where a GOG value, we can simply visualize it. The versioning is needed that we not only understand that semantic has changed, but whenever we introduce new semantics, that we know basically if the new version is actually backward compatible or not. So with that, we are preventing that we are actually breaking the end-to-end data processing pipeline. So in Yang push defined in RFC 8641, we are actually missing semantics and versioning, and within this document, we are liking to address this. Next slide, please. So network operators need to control semantics in its data processing pipeline. That includes Yang push, that today it's only possible that's only possible during the Yang push subscription, but not when nodes are being upgraded or messages are being published. So for instance, if I do a subscription, I cannot really include the version or the semantic version. So basically, I'm just subscribing to an XPath, and when the node is being upgraded, that version of the Yang model could change and could potentially introduce a new version which is not backward compatible to the previous one. So with this extension, we can actually subscribe now to either a specific revision of an XPath, or we can map it towards a revision label. So we can say that when the node is being upgraded, it needs to be backward compatible to that revision label. On the other hand, when the notification message is being pushed, we have a Yang push header, and today we only have a reference to the subscription ID, but we do not have a semantic reference. And in this document, we are proposing to add the revision and the revision label, but also the module and the namespace and the XPath or subtree filter as a reference, so that we have clearly a semantic reference, and we understand not only the message itself, but also what the fields, the dimensions are meaning. Next slide, please. Here, just an example from a notification message on the left-hand side in JSON, on the right-hand side in XML. I highlighted the yellow part, the additional metadata in Yang push we are adding here. Next slide, please. Do you recognize the problem statement? Network operators need to control semantics in the data processing pipeline, and therefore want to persist the revision or semantic version also when we upgrade nodes, have a semantic reference in the notification message, and we are working on sample implementations in the IETF115 hackathon. Yes, please.
Yes.
Hi, Jason Stern. I guess I haven't thought about this problem a lot yet. I might be missing something, but it worries me a little bit to pack all the compatibility information into each update. It seems like a lot of overhead for something that may not change very frequently, whereas notifications arriving is a very high throughput data stream. So I'm not sure if we should be exchanging information about versions of the data kind of out of band relative to the actual notifications coming back. I mean, we do have other mechanisms in NetConf to advertise what module versions are being used in a server and to indicate when those have changed. So I don't know if we want to maybe somehow tie into those rather than encoding that right into the data stream. That's just an initial thought.
Sure, thanks.
So Rob Wilson, Cisco as a contributor. So you presented this earlier, or work related to this in the side meeting and things, and so I'll give you lots of comments back on that and things. And generally, I think this is good work and useful work to do. I think the sort of high-level comment I gave, one of the comments I gave back there, is I think you may need to either have a list of modules that you identify rather than a single module, or a Yang package that's sort of identifying something bigger. To go back to Jason's point, and I think it's a valid comment he's made in terms of efficiency. I think the key point here is you need to be versioning the individual values that are coming through. So if the schema changes, you can know and store in your database the fact that that's changed, and you've got different values at different versions in your database. So I think that's probably the key thing that maybe is the more efficient way to doing it, but that's the key problem that's being solved, I think.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Balázs Lengyel Eriksson. I have seen from Benoit a separate draft, this data collection manifest. How would this come together with that?
Yeah, so it's addressing basically a similar need, but there basically it's about having additional metadata describing basically the data collection, how the data is being collected on the node itself, while here the focus is actually on having the semantic reference. So the two have, I mean, they're both adding metadata, but different metadata.
Just to complete Thomas' answer, also, this is actually exactly what we need to map, for instance, the path is exactly what we need to map the data we just collected to their manifest. So in that sense, they are complementary, because the information you get from the Yang push here, well, will be the one that you actually need to have in order to do this mapping afterwards.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks.
So we're already into the non-chartered items, I see.
Mm-hmm.
So this is one of the drafts that I was mentioning in the transaction ID talk, the W3C context trace. So it's an entirely new draft that we are posting. Next slide, please. We realized when we deleted this from the transaction ID draft, the tracing parts, that something like this will be needed anyway, but okay, let's do that in a separate draft then, a separate mechanism. And actually that was pretty good, because then we started to look around what's already out there. And we found this, well, there is actually something very similar that's already applicable to REST-conf, at least REST, that's provided by W3C. And we then decided, okay, let's make a proposal to bring those REST headers into a NetConf context here, and actually reuse the full stack exactly as possible, so you can have the same implementation for this that you might already have. And you see down there on the bottom, we have a reference to the open telemetry specification that's talking about this specifically. And telemetry here is a vague term, and the open telemetry is not exactly the same as Yang push or GNMI. You can take the next slide. So here's the reference to the specification that WCC has, and it defines two headers, REST headers. One is called trace parent, the other one is trace state, where trace state is optional. And trace parent is basically something, it's a pretty random number, much like a UUID. There are a few fields here that have some meaning, but mostly it's just a random number. To trace, if a client is making a request to a server, what the effects on that server would be. Next, please. So let's say we have a BSS that is sending down an order, and that's the easiest use case to imagine. This is an edit config, but it could be basically anything in RPC or whatever operation the BSS is doing. It's tagging that operation with a trace parent. And then it goes down and to an orchestrator, which is then sending work with the same trace ID down to its controllers and down to the devices. And then everybody can use the same IDs when they are sending data to, for example, melt, collect metrics and trace and log information. Then you can see the effects of this operation through the whole stack here. And you can use this for, I mean, many purposes like billing, debugging, or forensic. Thanks. And this is what it might look like in some tools. Since this is a well-known principle and extension headers extensions, there are already tools that can work with this stuff. So we then combine traces from the orchestration level, the controller level, and device level in a single tool. You can see how much time and effort and whatever effects this has on the entire system. Next. The proposed format here is basically we are taking these two headers and encoding them as XML attributes on the RPC envelope in NetConf. Next. So this having this trace is useful in many situations, as I said. Billing, sustainability, debugging, forensics comes to mind to me. We separate this from the transaction ID mechanism now, even though I think implementers will care about both at the same time. It's also separated from the same work. And we thought long and hard about whether to implement this or to propose this as being implemented using attributes or as Yang modeled leaves. I was originally a proponent of doing it as Yang leaves because then you can use augment and deviate and other things that we already know about. But in the end, when we really dug down into it, it makes better sense, in my opinion, right now to do this as attributes. It's an easier definition and easier to work with. It's exactly the same format as you have in W3C. That's what but it's an open question still. This overlaps greatly with the other trace draft that's ongoing right now, but maybe we can discuss together. I think that was all for me. I think there's no more slides, right?
Yes.
Jason Stern. I guess I'm not really understanding how you do it with a leaf. Like that would be a convention, I guess, in everybody's data models? Like a...
No, I mean, you could augment the edit config operation and get config operation and so on.
But to actually store this tag or whatever.
The server would have to implement this functionality, and then you would see these leaves coming from the client and do whatever is necessary to track it.
But you want to store this tag or whatever against individual elements in the data store.
No. I mean, you do this on the RPC level, so it's not data store kind of thing. It's a leaf in the RPC header, just like data store name or something running. It's not something, you don't store the value running in the edit config.
No, but then what would this ID be stored against in the database?
Yeah, I mean, it's not, these attributes are not tagged towards a specific leaf, really. They are stored against the operation or tracked against the operation. So an entire edit config or an entire get config or an entire lock or whatever it is that you are doing for operation, that's what you need to track here.
I guess then what are you retrieving from the node later?
No, it's not a node level thing. It's for when you are generating log messages, for example. It might be used by the implementation to send out the log message, tagging it with this thing. I did this because
of that. So it's ephemeral. It's only during the processing of that transaction, then it's lost.
Yes.
So it's stateless in the router.
It's something that pertains to the RPCs themselves, and you don't need necessarily store it towards the data.
So Ahmed Al-Hassani. So I have a question. You know, with OpenTelemetry, you usually have the trace ID, and then inside your application, you have a lot of spans that you can narrow down what's happening inside your application. do you envision later on some of that will be standardized inside whatever Yang store is there, or who's handling these things, or you think it's just going to be implementation specific, and for now we just stick that we have the trace ID and the rest is going to be depends on who is going to implementing that?
For now, this is definitely implementation specific for what you do with these traces. But if you have some ideas around how you would like to standardize that, sure, we can talk about that.
That'd be interesting. Thanks.
So Olga, before you get on the mic, I noticed you're not logged into MeetEcho, and that's why you're not on the queue. I'll let you go ahead and speak, but do make sure that you log into MeetEcho also. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I will log in. Hi, Olga Havel, Huawei. I just wanted to ask you, in your example here, you have one BSS, one client, and also you have kind of trace ID and the parent ID. But but then in the examples, you're saying you can look at the trace ID and find all the things that are related. How would you deal with the multiple applications? Let's say you have a provisioning versus assurance application, which may have conflicts of the trace contexts.
No, if you go back 2 slides or something like that, you can see that. Can you go back to?
Kent, all right, thanks.
Yeah, this one. Okay, that one, the one with XML. That one. You can see that the trace state has a value where you can have a comma separated. You can tag more and more things for different applications. So the Rojo application and Congo application can have their states independently there. So the W3C team thought about that. Yeah, that's right. This last slide here. There's also a few more drafts, sorry, not a few more specifications from W3C that are related, like the baggage specification. And that may also be interesting to bring in later. But I thought we'd start with one. And if people think this is a nice idea, we can continue with this other one. We already started working with this, but we decided to present only one.
Charles.
Yeah, hi, Charles Eckel from Cisco. And I think it's great kind of reusing, leveraging this mechanism from W3C. However, I don't participate in W3C. I don't know if you or some others who are in here, is this a mechanism that W3C is like happy with and is being used and working out well? Or, you know, we have some examples of things in IETF that we standardize and no one uses. So I want to make sure this is something that, you know, that they already think is working well and a good thing for us to leverage.
I'm not a W3C expert, but I think this is current. It's not very old, actually. It's just a year or something like that, the trace context. And baggage is actually not a specification yet. That's why we decided to hold off with that a bit, since it's still in motion. But so it's at least the current direction of W3C. For the how well used it will be in the future remains to be seen. But since it has been out for a while, there are some tools that are already working with this. So, and it's a mechanism that works well in the REST world. I mean, to have some headers is something. It's a pattern that we're using all the time.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. So, the queue was closed. I don't know who closed.
Sorry, I closed. Yeah, I closed it because we needed to move to the last presentation.
Okay.
Is there another comment?
This is the last. Oh, you know, wait a minute. Kent, I think you skipped over the external transaction ID.
Okay, sorry. Let me go back to that one.
Yes, hello. So I'm Jean Kilboeuf from Huawei, and I'm going to present you the very draft solving the same problem as the one we just saw, basically. So next slide, please. So for instance, we have this this let's say schema, this architecture with several orchestrators, several controllers, and several NEs. And if something happened, for instance, in NE2 that is causing an issue, and we can track it to a configuration error, and what we would like to do is to be able to understand where does the error come from. Actually, what was the original service request that caused the error. And so there are several use cases for that. It could be that there was a mistake somewhere. It could be that we have two NMS that are targeting the same NE, and so they are like reverting each other. Or it could be that actually there is an error in the intents, even higher up, and there is something that is actually conflicting. So we need to be able to track that, especially if we want to hope to automatize the network. So next slide, please. So we currently have a lot of information already stored in most data. I guess in NetConf we have that as well, but in most devices we have a single ID that maps to the config changes, so we are able to retrieve that already. And there is some configuration metadata that is stored usually with that, such as the timestamp, which user did the configuration, and the protocol, and so on. So we have the information here to find what is wrong with the configuration, and to find the corresponding wrong, what we call local commit ID. And so now the goal is the next step would be how to map that local commit ID to something that corresponds to a service request, for instance. So next slide, please. So the other existing is the transaction ID, which actually does exactly that, but mapping the configuration sent by a client to the configuration in the server, because they will have a common transaction ID. And so this is the ID that we want to use in this solution, is to keep the track of the IDs, so that we can then go back to from the server that was configured to the client, and so on. And so the idea here is more to keep inside the server who configured the client last, and with ID. So next slide, please. So we have a little bit of vocabulary to explain that. So basically, if we take the transaction, take TX1 here, the controller is, for the controller, TX1 is a northbound transaction because it's going to configure the controller, and for the orchestrator is a southbound orchestration. And so the idea is just to keep in each element, whenever there is a local commit ID, so a configuration change, if that configuration was caused by someone that has this mechanism enabled, then we can track the corresponding transaction ID. So we can map to the local commit ID, the northbound transaction ID, if any, and the southbound transaction IDs, if any. So next slide, please. So the idea to store that is just to store that in a Yang model, which is fairly simple. Exactly what I said before. We have the local transaction ID. We have the northbound transaction ID. In that case, we also need to keep some kind of ID of the client, which is just a string at the moment, maybe something we need to work on. And we also, if there are some transaction IDs, we need to keep the southbound transaction IDs. Next slide, please. So this is how it would be used. So for instance, we have an anomaly detection system that is able to find in any an error. So this would be the first step at the bottom here. And then if we identify the configuration, we can find the corresponding northbound transaction ID. So we can go to the controller, and the controller then can match the can return us which southbound transaction ID, which actually local commit ID on the controller match this southbound transaction ID and the corresponding northbound transaction ID as step 4, if any. And finally, we can reach the top and find back the original service request. And that would be at this point, we can see where the information started in our stack of NMSs. So next slide, please. So there was one feature that Jan was talking before, that was that we could set from the client the transaction ID when configuring to the server. So that would actually simplify a lot our work, because instead of having several transaction IDs, southbound transaction IDs would have a single one. So that would be, and that would also possibly avoid collision between southbound transaction IDs. So that would be good for us. So then the question is also, because that draft, I mean, started as something kind of generic, we need to trace the ID, we need to have a transaction ID between the elements. The question is NetConf only the right scope, or do we, this is the current decision to have NetConf, but maybe we need to include more. So maybe this is, I mean, here we're in NetConf, but I will also be presenting it in the Ops at WG, which is more the target actually for this draft. So this is the kind of question maybe more for there. And then the link with the draft. So I think this is the main point we should discuss, this one. And so for that one, the question is, so I think we had a very good presentation of this one. I think it's very nice solution as well. The main difference, in my opinion, is that it's nice to have also the information kept into the router, because in that case, even if we didn't capture the trace, we can still find back the original solution. So maybe, I don't know, I'm just like proposing something here out of my head, but maybe it could be that we have the two mechanisms. So one with, basically we can use the same mechanism of augmenting the RPC to send the information. And then we could maybe store it so that we have it locally. And but also we can send it to the trace server. So I think that would be the kind of ideal solution, because in that case, even if we don't, for instance, if the top orchestrator does not know to which collector he has to send it, we can still retrieve the information afterwards. So yeah. So next slide. I think it's the last one.
Thank you.
Please.
Yeah, that's Balas.
But I have one serious problem with this. You have the client ID in this. Where do you get that client ID from? I don't.
Yes.
And just imagine that, for example, I have a CLI client that uses, I don't know, even as a simple SSH and sends in XML messages. How will that have a client ID?
Well, so this is something that needs to be provided only for. I mean, this is only in the case when we actually get the transaction ID, which means it's a client that supports the transaction ID and clients that support the transaction ID mechanism. If we want to implement this draft, they will have to as well send their client ID.
Sorry, we can't tell the client that it must send or must use some transaction ID, but how will it get the client ID? So I start the same CLI twice. Will it be the same CLI? Is there a difference? I can implement it. Just tell me what the value should be.
Yeah. So that's another inventory problem. So yeah, this one this is the part that yeah, I don't have a good answer for that at the moment.
Kent?
Yes, I Kent as chair. To your last question with regards to if we should apply to RESTConf as well, I think it is the case that with the NetConf working group, it should try to attempt a feature parity between NetConf and RESTConf.
Benoit?
Benoit Claes. So initially we posted this one obstacle UG, but we're not religious about that, right? We thought it could be a generic mechanism. There is like a Yang model, and by the way, that's something Jean stressed, that we believe that having the leaf in the router is a good thing, even if we could have it also, you know, with open telemetry. So it's a Yang module, it's a generic mechanism. There is normative reference to NetConf and Transition ID, so we're not too sure where to put it. Any guidance here would be helpful.
All right. As a chair, I would also like to see the linkage and the dependency between the three drafts, the transaction ID, the W3C draft, and this one, to really understand how we want to progress whether we want to progress all the three documents, and if so, what is the dependency between the three of them? All right, if there are no other questions, thank you.
There was this last slide. Did you want to speak to this last slide?
All right, he's coming back.
No, you can read the slide. Just maybe there is a repo, and actually Med did some comments on the repo. So if you have some comments, you can also go there. I will try to put them back in the group as well, so that it's not lost.
All right, thanks.
And I do apologize for the mix-up on the slides. There's two of them that are referring to tracing. So. Last presentation.
Yeah, good afternoon. Can you hear me okay?
All right, go ahead, James.
All right, I
Hi,
passed
can
slide
you hear
control
me?
to you. Yes, we hear you, and I pass slide control to you.
Perfect. Hi, I'm James Cumming. I'm going to introduce the private candidates draft. It's the first time of us going through it and presenting it. And Rob Wills is in the room as well. He's going to present as well halfway through. There we go. So the problem space, what we looked at here is the ability to try and streamline some of the operations in NetConf configuration. Currently, most NetConf servers have the shared candidate concept, and multiple clients can make changes to that shared candidate. And there's a couple of issues with that. The biggest one, of course, being that one client may make changes to the server that they maybe hadn't pushed themselves unwittingly. And we have the kind of locking solution available to us. But what that does is, of course, streamline and serialize everything that happens on that device. And maybe that's not appropriate if multiple clients are wishing to configure entirely separate areas of the configuration. Many current networking devices already support private candidates as a concept, and that's what we wanted to standardize here. So this just graphically demonstrates the current issues with locking. Really, you end up with a completely serialized process, and that might be okay in some cases, but in a lot of cases where maybe there are different clients configuring different areas, it can really hamper the operational kind of behavior. So the high-level aims of the draft is to define what a private candidate is, look at how we can create one and manipulate it over netconf, and then how we deal with conflict resolution if and when it arises. And I think the first question, we just wanted to stop here and just check with the working group whether this was a problem space that people have some interest in. There are a number of more slides kind of going into details of what we as the authors and the contributors had looked at. But I just wanted to get a kind of general feeling from the room as to whether it's a useful piece of work. I don't know what the best way to do that is, a poll or a
All
hung
right.
or...
Okay, to the room. I know we could do a poll, but let's do quickly in the room. Do the people in the room feel that this is a problem we want to tackle? A show of hands or hum? All right, James, so you do have some sense that it is a problem we want to solve.
Okay, great, thank you. So firstly, what is a private candidate? So a private candidate configuration would be a candidate configuration that's not visible to anyone else. By anyone else, we kind of feel that is a per session anyone else, so an individual session. And it gives a private workspace for users to stage new configurations prior to committing. It would contain a full copy of the running configuration. Now, an implementation detail is whether or not you would store that or otherwise, but in terms of how it would represent itself to the outside world, it would be a full configuration containing all changes made by that session. And I graphically kind of described how we'd go about creating that in the next couple of slides. And I used compare, if you think of the compare draft that exists, just as a kind of representation to help understand what might happen. So the bottom line is our kind of running configuration, and I've done this in a source code type way so that there's some common understanding in terms of terminology that hopefully makes it a bit clearer. I know as authors and contributors, we spent a bit of time kind of hashing this out, and we felt this was probably the clearest way of representing it. So at the point you issue an RPC that requires a candidate configuration or a private candidate configuration, we would branch the running configuration into its own branch. And then any operation would manipulate that branch from that session. So you see multiple edit configs. And if you were to compare the current state of your private candidate branch, it would compare it with, or you could compare it with the head of that branch to see what changes had been made. Or you could compare it with the running configuration as well to see the differences between your current working branch and the running. And of course, this running might change in the background. And to that aim, there was two methods that we'd thought of for how you might want to deal and interact with this branch. One we called a static branch mode, which is kind of akin to the source code approach, where those multiple edit configs make a change to your branch, and then at the point you commit, and there's some more details on potential other RPCs later or in the draft. At the point you commit, you then merge it back to that running configuration, and then essentially rebase and remove that head further up your branch. So we wouldn't destroy that private candidate, we would just update it. And then from that point on, any more edit configs and any more compares would compare to that new head of the branch. The other option that we thought about was a continuous rebase mode. And this is where, again, we start off the same, we create our branch, edit configs, make a change to that branch. But every time that a commit from another client pushes their data into the running configuration, we would automatically rebase the current working branch. And that means, therefore, that any compares would go to the current head of that branch. So this is the continuous rebase mode. And again, at the point you hit commit, you would follow the same process. You would merge and then rebase. And again, after that merge and rebase, we just continue as before. And if any more changes happen to the running configuration, they would automatically get rebased into the private candidate as well. Rob, did you want to take it from here?
So we will also have considered how the client would sort of interact with the private candidate, and we've come up with two options, which are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Like you could in theory implement both. So the first option being a capability, and when that capability is specified, the existing NetConf candidate data store behaves like a private candidate, and so the get config, edit config operations, etc., where the target is candidate, would actually be acting against the private candidate. A clear benefit of that is that existing NetConf clients that are used to interacting with target equals candidate would be able to easily use private candidates. The other option is an NMDA data store, a new NMDA data store. So we could define a data store for the private candidate, and then the get data, edit data operations could operate against that data store. Next slide, please. So James was talking about with those diagrams with the branches of what the private candidate looks like at any point in time, and the relationship between the private candidate and the running data store. If two clients are operating on completely different areas of the configuration tree, then clearly there's no real conflict between the clients. But of course, the fun starts happening when two clients want to change the same configuration. And there's kind of various places where this could occur. So with the first mode that James presented, with the static branch, when it comes to, so your static branch is sort of unaware of changes to the running data store. And so the point where you could have collisions is when you then try and commit your private candidates, because at that point you have to reconcile the changes that you've made in your private candidate with the running data store. In the second mode, in the continuous rebase mode, in that case, every time the running config changes, that's brought up into the private candidate, and clearly, therefore, there's chances for collisions there. And this list is not necessarily exhaustive. So that's kind of where collisions could occur. How might you resolve them? This is something that we've been actively discussing, and will continue to do so. There's potentially the option of having an update to RPC to kind of update the private candidates, and at that point collisions could be returned as a result of the RPC. We've also discussed the possibility of a force option, so that at the point where you reconcile the collisions, you could have it so that the changes in your private candidate are sort of forced through. Just to reiterate, we're still sort of thinking about this, and the draft goes into more detail about the considerations that we discussed. Next slide, please. And so just to bring this to an end, the things we're actively working on at the moment are the reconciliation methods. So that's the how we resolve the collisions. Also, sorry, not how we resolve the collisions, I should say, whether we use the static branch mode or the continuous rebase mode. The interaction methods, do we want to have a capability or a new NMDA data store, or do we want to standardize both and allow implementations to pick which one? And also conflict resolution is something we're very actively working on.
Jules.
Hi, Charles Eckel, Cisco. one of the things I wasn't sure about with the NMDA candidate store, that approach, would it be possible for actually multiple clients to use the same, like private to those candidates group, store, but not have like all the other random clients use it? Is that something that's actually a use case that's you're trying to consider and that you think is has value?
So that's not a use case we've considered. So at the moment, a private candidate is very much specific to a session. I'm slightly reluctant to sort of have shared candidates between a subset of sessions. That seems sort of to add some complexity potentially.
Okay, yeah, it was just something when you mentioned those two different methods, it came to mind, and I was wondering if that was one of the reasons for supporting that, rather than just sending the saying you want the current candidate to be treated as a private candidate. In that case, everyone has their own, right? Every client has their own.
So James wanted to pitch in, I guess.
Yeah, I was to say we have a similar concept with the persist ID from commits, but it's not something we had focused on unless the working group feels there's some strong kind of use cases for
that. So Rob Wilton as a participant. So I think it's interesting in this work and potentially this work from the hands that were raised earlier. I think one of the key things that's to me is that today different vendors are sort of implementing this in different ways. And if the working group wants to work on this, the key decision in my mind is, do they try and standardize one solution that everyone aims for, or do we try and effectively just sort of have a solution that documents with some flexibility the different choices, that ends up a little bit more like the with defaults solution, where you can at least advertise to the clients what you do, but you don't get quite such strong standardization that clients then have to support different methods. So that to me is the key question in this work.
Right, Joe.
Joe Clark, Cisco. Maybe a little related to what Rob was saying. Do you have to have one or the other reconciliation method? Could the client not decide? This actually came up the other day in the NOC, where one user wanted to do some more long-running type of config testing, and there was automation that was pushing config. And if there was two private candidates, they may want something more long-running where there's continuous integration. The automation wants something where it's private, does the test and does the commit. And on the other, the conflict resolution, for me, I would think you'd rather have something that is on merge. If it's a conflict, it aborts, it fails. It seems anything else is going to get into like get merge hell type of thing. And it seems the biggest use case is just, can I do my candidate push? Is it going to work or not? Versus trying to do conflict resolution and merge resolution.
So one of the things that James and myself and the other contributors have tried to do is to define a sort of common set of terminology, and also to find commonalities between the two reconciliation methods. It doesn't necessarily answer your question, but it's just making the point that although there were these two methods proposed, we've tried to sort of commonize sort of where we can.
I mean, I think you're right, Joe, and it's useful to for the client to understand if there is an issue and to know what that issue is. And I think that's the kind of starting point is, don't go committing stuff if there's going to be an issue. Don't suddenly kind of auto deal with it. That's probably not the approach. We want the client to be aware that there's an issue. How you then deal with that issue could be as simple as, I mean, you fail and they have to go fix the private candidate and then you're all good again. Or it could be that, there's some override, or that maybe you just needed to update your baseline. And that's where the update RPC would come in. Some of those are documented in the draft. And certainly it's an area that we'd welcome contributions.
Right. Andy?
Comment. I really think the working group needs to clearly specify all the requirements before diving into a solution. I think that the session-based approach doesn't support RESTConf, for example, because RESTConf doesn't have sessions, and I think it's important that it be protocol independent and support both NetConf and RESTConf, and it needs to be per user, not per session, because of that, but also because there's no reason why an application can't have multiple sessions working on the same, if it's the same user, then that's easy for the server to control. Also, it needs to be explicitly managed, because you can't fire up multiple copies of the running config that easy. So source management is critical. So, and then the details of how it works, I think you probably end up with something like Rob suggested, where there's like 3 variants. The original NetConf has the 3 variants because of data stores, because that's what the vendors supported. So it wasn't possible to do one size fits all, and that's probably the case here. That's it.
Right. Kent?
Would you be able to put it on the list so I can keep track of it as well? And I definitely welcome support on the RESTConf side.
Kent as a contributor, just speaking to the idea of continuous rebase, and I think others have spoken about this as already, but this concerns, I think there's already it's unexpected for clients that the server would change the data store underneath them, and without them buying or opting into it. And by analogy, in NetMud, there's a draft for doing with system defined data store, and there was the idea that the system data store might be changing underfoot, and it could actually impact the running data store without the client's supervision. And the fix for that was for the client to pass a parameter into its RPCs, which basically said, I opt into the idea that the server will dynamically or automatically implicitly change the contents of the data store underneath. And so here, maybe it follows that if you're using private candidates at all, then the client has already bought into that idea that it's possible. But I'm not sure if that's completely true, and something we should discuss some more.
So Ken, if I kind of read that right, is the previous solution essentially saying that the kind of static branch mode is the default, but you would drop to a continuous rebase mode if you sent some kind of operation to the node?
Yes, something along those lines could be feasible.
Okay,
But
so
the
that
client,
would be
because there's a number of legacy clients out there that will not be expecting for the change to occur. But if the client can advertise that it's okay with the idea that it could occur, and it can handle that case, then it's okay.
Okay, Walid?
I just wanted to just mention it would be necessary, I think, to consider the interaction with certain scenarios like confirmed commit, for example. Like, let's say, for example, if there's another confirmed commit, you already received the first commit, you didn't get the second commit yet, and then you try to rebase before getting the second commit. You need to think about how you're going to do that, because in the end, whatever you have as active running right now might not be actually true. Might get rolled back at some point of time. Does that make sense?
in the static rebase mode, absolutely. In the auto rebase mode, it probably wouldn't matter as much, because you would auto rebase twice if you rolled back. But But in the static rebase mode, yeah, you would have an out of date baseline.
Okay, we don't have any more questions. Thank you, everyone. So that pretty much brings the NetConf session towards an end. Thank you, everyone, for coming to the meeting and for participating. Bye. That's okay. What we do is go back to the recording. That's how we did. But yes, but having notes helps. Thank you for your help. Yep. And a little bit of a hiccup in the beginning, but I think we got through it.
Good. A hiccup in the beginning, you said.
Yeah, I mean, a little bit of nervous moments and like trying to figure out how to handle the situation, right? So I think the moment he started, the mic wouldn't work. And then the screen went blank. So both happened and it's like,
There's a spare hat out up on the control.
oh, there is.
Yeah, there's a spare one. You just have to turn it on and it works.
Okay.
Yeah, I should have maybe mentioned it.
Yeah, maybe it should.
Tomorrow we can just put it on here.
Yeah, even that would be helpful.
Just
Yeah.
have to be careful that you don't turn it on and stand right next to the
Oh,
screen.
that's true.
But yeah, but we can leave it there tomorrow. I'll put new
Yeah.
batteries.
Okay.